The rain drummed against the Vienna clinic windows as Dr. Elizabeth Hartmann reviewed the file of her newest patient. At 37, Marcus had already survived 3 failed marriages, countless job dismissals, and what he described as a lifetime of feeling everything too deeply. His hands shook slightly as he sat across from her in the consultation room, his eyes carrying that familiar weight she had seen in so many empaths who had wandered into her practice, souls who absorbed the world's pain like sponges but had never learned to wring themselves dry. "Tell me about your childhood," Elizabeth began, though she suspected she already knew the broad strokes of the story that would unfold. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tracing patterns on the leather armchair. "I was the sensitive one," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My father called me weak. Said I cried too much, felt too much. My mother, she was always sad, and I thought it was my job to make her happy. I remember being 7 years old and, lying awake at night, feeling her depression seep through the walls like cold air." Elizabeth nodded, recognizing the familiar pattern that Carl Jung had identified decades earlier, the empath trapped in what Jung termed the childhood story, a narrative of hypersensitivity and emotional responsibility that, while once serving as a survival mechanism, had crystallized into a prison of perpetual suffering. Marcus continued, his words flowing with the relief of finally being heard. "I've always been able to feel what others feel. In school, I knew when Sarah Martinez was going to cry before she did. When my friend David's parents were fighting, I get this sick feeling in my stomach hours before he'd even tell me about it. Everyone said I was gifted, that I had a special ability. But it never felt like a gift. It felt like a curse." This was the paradox Elizabeth encountered daily in her work with highly sensitive individuals. Their profound capacity for empathy, while genuinely remarkable, had become entangled with childhood adaptations that no longer served their adult lives. Jung's revolutionary insight, which she had spent the better part of 2 decades studying and applying, suggested that true empathic power could only emerge when one courageously dismantled the protective but limiting story of the sensitive child. "Marcus," she said gently, "what if I told you that your sensitivity isn't the problem? What if the real issue is the story you've been telling yourself about what your sensitivity means?" He looked puzzled, tilting his head like a curious bird. "I don't understand." Jung believed that we all carry within us 2 versions of ourselves, the weak self that was formed in childhood as a response to circumstances beyond our control, and the authentic self that contains our true power. The weak self isn't actually weak, it's incredibly strong, but in ways that no longer serve us. It's strong in hypervigilance, strong in people-pleasing, strong in absorbing others' emotions. But this strength has become a weakness because it prevents us from accessing our genuine empathic gifts. Elizabeth had seen this transformation countless times. The empath who learned to differentiate between their authentic intuitive abilities and their childhood survival mechanisms became almost unstoppable. They retained their profound capacity for understanding and connection while developing an inner fortress that protected their energy and emotional well-being. Marcus leaned forward, suddenly more alert. "So you're saying there's a difference between being an empath and being, what did you call it, the weak self?" "Exactly. The weak self mimics empathy but is actually a form of emotional codependency. It says, I must feel what you feel to keep you happy and keep myself safe. True empathy says, I can understand what you feel while remaining centered in my own emotional truth." The difference is profound. As Marcus left that first session, Elizabeth reflected on the journey that lay ahead of him. She had witnessed this transformation in hundreds of clients over the years, and, while the path was never easy, it was always profound. The process of destroying the weak self, what Jung called the false persona, required tremendous courage, but it was the only way to access the empowered empath that lay dormant within. 3 weeks later, Marcus returned with a different energy about him. He had been practicing the awareness exercises Elizabeth had taught him, learning to distinguish between his own emotions and those he was unconsciously absorbing from others. "Something strange happened yesterday," he said, settling into his chair with noticeably more confidence. "I was at lunch with my colleague Janet, and she started complaining about her marriage problems. Usually, I would feel this overwhelming urge to fix everything, to take on her sadness and carry it home with me. But, instead, I found myself listening with genuine care while staying completely grounded in my own center. I could feel her pain, but it wasn't my pain. Does that make sense?" Elizabeth smiled. Perfect sense. What you experienced was authentic empathy rather than emotional enmeshment. Tell me, how did it feel different in your body? Lighter, Marcus said without hesitation. Usually, after conversations like that, I feel drained for days. This time, I felt energized. Like I had actually been helpful instead of just absorbing. This was the beginning of what Jung identified as the individuation process, the journey of separating one's authentic self from the adaptive patterns developed in childhood. For empaths, this process was particularly complex because their sensitivity, while genuine, had become so intertwined with survival mechanisms that they couldn't distinguish between their gift and their wound. Elizabeth had studied under Dr. Maria Hoffman, one of Jung's former students, who had spent her final years developing therapeutic approaches specifically for highly sensitive individuals. Hoffman had observed that empaths who successfully individuated didn't lose their sensitivity, they refined it into a powerful tool for healing and connection while developing what she called empathic sovereignty. Marcus, I want to share something with you that might sound challenging, Elizabeth said during their fourth session. Jung believed that our greatest wounds contain the seeds of our greatest gifts. Your childhood experience of feeling responsible for everyone's emotions wasn't just a burden, it was developing your capacity for extraordinary emotional intelligence. But, now you need to learn to use this intelligence consciously rather than compulsively. Marcus had been making remarkable progress, but Elizabeth knew they were approaching the most difficult phase of the work. Destroying the weak self required confronting the deepest fears that had shaped the original survival strategy. For most empaths, this meant facing the terror of being alone, rejected, or seen as selfish. I've been thinking about what you said, Marcus said the following week, about the difference between my gift and my wound. I realize I've been using my sensitivity like a shield. If I can feel what everyone needs, if I can anticipate their moods and reactions, then I can control the outcome. I can make sure nobody leaves me. And, now I'm starting to see that the constant vigilance, the emotional management of everyone around me, it's exhausting. And, it's not even real connection. It's more like emotional manipulation, but unconscious. This was the breakthrough Elizabeth had been waiting for. The recognition that the weak self, despite its appearance of selflessness and care, was actually a sophisticated control mechanism designed to ensure emotional safety. Once this pattern became conscious, the real work could begin. Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is being who you are, Elizabeth said. But, first, we must destroy who we think we should be. For you, Marcus, this means letting go of the story that your worth depends on your ability to manage other people's emotions. The transformation that followed was both beautiful and terrifying to witness. Marcus began setting boundaries with family members who had grown accustomed to using him as their emotional dumping ground. He stopped automatically saying yes to requests that drained his energy. Most challenging of all, he began expressing his own needs and feelings, even when it might disappoint others. My sister called me selfish last week, he reported during session 7, though his tone was more curious than wounded. She's going through a divorce and expected me to drop everything to listen to her vent for 3 hours. When I said I could only talk for 30 minutes because I had plans, she exploded. How did you respond? I told her I loved her and that I was available for 30 minutes of focused, quality conversation. She hung up on me. Marcus paused, then smiled. And, you know what? I felt sad for her, but I didn't take on her anger. I didn't spend the rest of the week feeling guilty or trying to fix things between us. Elizabeth nodded approvingly. What you're describing is empowered empathy. You remained open to her pain while maintaining your own boundaries and emotional integrity. This is what Jung meant when he wrote about the integrated personality, someone who can hold space for others without losing themselves in the process. The weeks that followed brought a series of tests as Marcus's family and friends adjusted to his new way of being. Some relationships deepened as people learned to relate to him more authentically. Others fell away as individuals who had grown dependent on his emotional caretaking found other sources for their needs. It's like I'm becoming a different person, Marcus reflected during their 10th session, but also like I'm becoming myself for the first time. Does that make sense? Complete sense. Jung called this the transcendent function, the ability to hold paradox. You're not becoming different, you're becoming authentic. The sensitive child who learned to survive by managing others' emotions was never the real you. It was a brilliant adaptation, but it was still an adaptation. As their work together deepened, Elizabeth began introducing Marcus to what Jung considered the ultimate goal of individuation for empaths, the development of what he termed conscious empathy. This involved learning to use empathic abilities as a tool rather than being used by them. I want you to imagine your sensitivity as a radio, Elizabeth explained during one session. Right now, you're picking up every station simultaneously: your neighbor's anxiety, your boss's frustration, the general emotional static of everyone you encounter. But what if you could tune into specific frequencies at will? What if you could turn the volume down when you needed to rest, and turn it up when you wanted to deeply understand someone? Marcus's eyes lit up with understanding. You're talking about choice. About using my sensitivity instead of being overwhelmed by it. Exactly. The weak self has no choice, it compulsively absorbs everything. The empowered empath chooses when, how, and with whom to engage empathically. This concept revolutionized Marcus's daily experience. He began practicing what Elizabeth called empathic boundaries, conscious decisions about when to open his emotional antennae and when to close them. He learned to distinguish between his intuitive hits about people and his anxiety-driven projections. Most importantly, he developed the ability to feel others' emotions without making those emotions his responsibility. 6 months into their work together, Marcus experienced what Jung would have recognized as a major breakthrough. He had been invited to his ex-wife's wedding, an event that would have previously sent him into weeks of emotional turmoil as he absorbed and processed her anxiety, excitement, guilt, and whatever complicated feelings the other guests brought to the occasion. I went, he told Elizabeth with quiet pride. Not only did I go, but I enjoyed myself. I could feel the complex emotional currents in the room: my ex-wife's nervousness, her mother's disapproval, the groom's family's excitement. But, instead of being overwhelmed by it all, I felt like an emotional anthropologist, observing with compassion but not taking any of it on. How did that feel? Powerful. Like I had finally learned to use my gift instead of being used by it. I was genuinely happy for Sarah, genuinely present for the celebration, and I went home energized instead of drained. Elizabeth recognized this as a milestone moment. Marcus had successfully differentiated between his authentic empathic abilities and his childhood survival patterns. He was no longer the sensitive child who felt responsible for managing everyone's emotional world. He had become an empowered empath who could choose when and how to engage his gifts. But Jung's work suggested that true individuation required one more step, what he called the integration of the shadow. For empaths, this meant acknowledging and integrating the parts of themselves they had long denied or projected onto others. Marcus, we need to talk about anger, Elizabeth said during their 15th session. In all our work together, you've mentioned feeling sad, overwhelmed, anxious, and drained. But you've never mentioned feeling angry. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. I don't really get angry. I mean, I get frustrated sometimes, but anger, that's not really who I am. Who told you that? The question hung in the air like smoke. Marcus was quiet for a long moment before responding. My father. He said anger was ugly, that sensitive people like me should never lose control like that. My mother said angry people were scary and unpredictable. Elizabeth nodded knowingly. So you learned to be the opposite, always calm, always understanding, always absorbing others' anger instead of feeling your own. I guess so. But what happened to your anger? Where did it go? Marcus looked genuinely puzzled by the question. Elizabeth had seen this pattern countless times: empaths who had so thoroughly repressed their own anger that they had forgotten it existed. But Jung's work suggested that this repressed anger often became the fuel for the very patterns that kept them trapped. I think maybe I turn it inward. Into guilt or shame, or that feeling of being drained all the time. What if your anger is actually trying to tell you something important? What if it's your psyche's way of saying this situation is not acceptable or you deserve better treatment? Over the following sessions, Marcus began the delicate work of reclaiming his anger not as an explosive, destructive force, but as valuable information about his boundaries and needs. He learned that his chronic people-pleasing had been, in part, a way of avoiding the discomfort of others' anger at his boundaries. But, in doing so, he had also cut himself off from his own righteous indignation when he was mistreated. "I realized something this week," Marcus said during their 18th session. "My ex-wife used to guilt-trip me constantly about money, about time, about not being emotional enough or being too emotional. And I would just absorb it, try to understand her perspective, work harder to meet her needs. But underneath all that understanding, I was furious. I just couldn't admit it, even to myself. What would have happened if you had acknowledged your anger? I would have had to set boundaries. I would have had to risk her leaving me. And maybe she would have respected me more. Maybe we could have worked things out. Or maybe we would have ended things sooner instead of dragging out years of mutual resentment." This integration of his shadow, his repressed anger, his legitimate needs for respect and reciprocity marked another crucial phase in Marcus's transformation. He was no longer the weak self who absorbed abuse in the name of empathy and understanding. He was becoming what Jung called the individuated person, someone who could be both deeply empathic and powerfully self-advocating. Jung wrote that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, Elizabeth shared during one of their later sessions. For empaths, this means accepting not just your sensitivity and capacity for care, but also your anger, your needs, your right to protection and boundaries. As Marcus integrated these previously rejected aspects of himself, something remarkable happened. His empathic abilities became even more refined and accurate. When he was no longer unconsciously carrying others' emotions as a way to manage his own anxiety, he could perceive emotional truths with startling clarity. "It's like the static cleared up," he explained. "When I was constantly absorbing everyone's feelings, it was all just noise. Now I can actually tune into what's really happening with people. I can sense what they need, but I can also sense what they're not ready to hear or receive. It's made me a much better friend, actually." This was exactly what Jung's research had suggested, that empaths who successfully individuated didn't lose their gifts but rather refined them into something far more powerful and useful. They became what Elizabeth thought of as empathic leaders, people who could hold space for others' pain without being consumed by it, who could offer genuine compassion without enabling dysfunction. A year into their work together, Marcus faced his greatest test. His mother called to inform him that his father had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia and that the family needed to coordinate his care. "The old me would have immediately volunteered to handle everything," Marcus told Elizabeth. "I would have felt guilty for every moment I wasn't managing his medical appointments or researching treatment options or mediating between my siblings. But something different happened this time." "What?" "I felt genuine sadness for my father, genuine concern for what this meant for our family. But I also felt clear about what I could and couldn't offer. I told my family I would contribute to finding good care for him, but I wouldn't be the point person for managing everyone's emotions about the situation." Elizabeth watched Marcus carefully as he spoke. There was no trace of the anxious, overwhelmed man who had walked into her office a year earlier. In his place sat someone who radiated what Jung called calm strength, the ability to remain centered and compassionate in the face of others' chaos. "How did your family respond?" "Better than I expected. My sister stepped up in ways she never had before. My brother started actually calling my father instead of just complaining about him. It's like my refusal to be the family emotional manager created space for everyone else to take responsibility for their own relationships." This was the paradox Elizabeth had observed repeatedly in her work. When empaths stopped trying to manage everyone's emotions, relationships often became more authentic and functional. People were forced to develop their own emotional skills instead of relying on the empath as their emotional crutch. Jung believed that our greatest service to others often comes not from what we do for them, but from who we become, Elizabeth reflected. By becoming emotionally sovereign, you've given your family permission to grow in ways they couldn't while you were carrying their emotional burdens. As their work together began to wind down, Elizabeth wanted to address one final aspect of Jung's teachings about empathic individuation, what he called the service of the authentic self. Jung believed that empaths who successfully destroyed their weak personas didn't become selfish or uncaring. Instead, they became capable of a deeper, more sustainable form of service to others. Marcus, I want you to imagine yourself 5 years from now. You've maintained the growth you've made here. You're living as your authentic self, using your empathic gifts consciously. What does your life look like? Marcus closed his eyes and was quiet for several minutes. When he opened them, his expression was peaceful and determined. I see myself in a helping profession, maybe counseling or social work. But I'm not burning out or taking on my clients' problems as my own. I'm able to hold space for their pain while maintaining my own center. I see myself in a relationship with someone who appreciates my sensitivity but doesn't depend on me to manage their emotions. I see myself setting boundaries with my family that actually allow for more genuine connection. What's different about that version of you compared to who you were when we started working together? He's not afraid of disappointing people. He's not afraid of being alone. He knows that his worth doesn't depend on how much he can absorb or fix for others. He's still deeply caring, but his care comes from choice, not compulsion. Elizabeth nodded with deep satisfaction. This vision represented what Jung considered the ultimate achievement of individuation, becoming fully oneself in service of both personal authenticity and genuine contribution to the world. In their final session together, Marcus reflected on the journey he had taken from wounded empath to empowered intuitive. I used to think that being sensitive meant being weak, that caring meant suffering, that empathy required self-sacrifice. Now I understand that true empathy is actually a form of strength, but only when it comes from choice rather than compulsion. What would you say to someone who's where you were a year ago? Elizabeth asked. Marcus considered the question carefully. I would tell them that their sensitivity isn't the problem. The problem is the story they've been told about what their sensitivity means. I would tell them that they don't have to choose between being empathic and being empowered. The real choice is between unconscious absorption and conscious compassion. As Marcus walked out of Elizabeth's office for the final time, she reflected on the transformation she had witnessed. He had successfully accomplished what Jung considered one of the most challenging tasks of human development, the destruction of the false self in service of the authentic self. The man who had walked into her office a year earlier had been trapped in what Jung called the pleasing persona, a character developed in childhood to ensure safety and belonging, but which had become a prison of endless emotional responsibility for others. Through the courageous work of individuation, Marcus had dismantled this false self and discovered the empowered empath that had always been waiting within. Jung's insight that the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others had proven true once again. Marcus was no longer vulnerable to emotional manipulation because he no longer needed others' approval to feel worthy. He was no longer overwhelmed by others' emotions because he had learned to distinguish between empathy and absorption. He was no longer trapped by childhood stories because he had authored a new narrative based on adult choice and conscious awareness. 6 months later, Elizabeth received a letter from Marcus. He had enrolled in a graduate program in counseling psychology and was working with a supervisor who specialized in highly sensitive individuals. His relationship with his family had stabilized into something more honest and sustainable. Most remarkably, he had begun dating someone who appreciated his emotional intelligence but didn't depend on him as their emotional regulator. I wanted to thank you for helping me understand the difference between being an empath and being empowered, the letter read. I still feel deeply, I still pick up on emotional currents that others miss, I still care profoundly about the suffering of others. But, now these capacities feel like gifts rather than curses. I can choose when to open my empathic channels and when to close them. I can hold space for others' pain without making it my own. Most importantly, I've learned that the greatest service I can offer others is my authentic presence, not my emotional management of their lives. Elizabeth filed the letter in her drawer of success stories, knowing that Marcus's transformation represented something far larger than individual healing. Each empath who learned to destroy their weak self and claim their authentic power became a beacon for others trapped in similar patterns. They proved that sensitivity and strength were not opposites but rather complementary aspects of human wholeness. Jung's revolutionary insight that empaths must let go of their childhood story of hypersensitivity and emotional responsibility to access their true gifts continued to transform lives decades after his death. The weak self, with its patterns of absorption, people-pleasing, and boundaryless care, was indeed strong, but it was the strength of survival, not thriving. The authentic self, with its capacity for conscious empathy, clear boundaries, and chosen service, represented the strength of true empowerment. The journey from wounded empath to empowered intuitive was never easy, but it was always possible. It required the courage to face childhood wounds, the willingness to disappoint others in service of authentic connection, and the commitment to developing new patterns of relating based on choice rather than compulsion. But, for those brave enough to undertake this journey, the rewards were immeasurable. They discovered that they could remain deeply caring without sacrificing their own well-being. They learned that setting boundaries actually enhanced their ability to serve others authentically. Most profoundly, they found that destroying the weak self didn't diminish their capacity for empathy, it liberated their empathy from the prison of unconscious patterns and allowed it to become a conscious tool for healing and connection. As Jung had promised, the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. Not because he becomes hard or uncaring, but because he becomes so rooted in his authentic truth that external validation or rejection no longer has the power to define his worth. He becomes, in Jung's words, a man who stands alone, not in opposition to others, but in service of his deepest truth. For empaths, this journey of individuation was particularly profound because their gifts, when liberated from childhood survival patterns, became some of the most powerful tools available for healing a world desperately in need of genuine empathy and understanding. The empath who had learned to destroy their weak self became what Jung envisioned as the healer of the future, someone capable of profound compassion without the need for emotional fusion, deep understanding without the compulsion to fix or save, and authentic presence without the requirement of self-sacrifice. In a world increasingly fragmented by technology, isolation, and emotional disconnection, these individuated empaths represented a crucial bridge between human hearts. They had learned to use their sensitivity as a conscious skill rather than an unconscious wound, and, in doing so, they offered a model of what Jung believed was humanity's next evolutionary step, the development of conscious empathy in service of both individual authenticity and collective healing. The story of every empath who successfully navigated this transformation became a testament to Jung's enduring insight that our greatest wounds, when courageously faced and consciously integrated, become the source of our greatest gifts. The sensitive child who learned to survive by managing others' emotions was never meant to remain trapped in that survival pattern forever. That child was meant to grow into the empowered adult who could use emotional intelligence as a conscious tool for service, connection, and authentic contribution to the healing of the world. This was Jung's ultimate vision, not the elimination of sensitivity, but its conscious refinement into a power that could never be taken away because it belonged not to the weak self that needed others' approval, but to the authentic self that drew its strength from the inexhaustible well of inner truth. The empath who discovered this truth became truly unstoppable, not because they no longer cared what others thought, but because they had learned to care from a place of choice rather than compulsion, from strength rather than need, from authentic love rather than unconscious fear. In the end, Jung's insight proved as revolutionary as it was simple. The empath emerges not by embracing the childhood story of hypersensitivity and emotional responsibility, but by having the courage to let that story die so that the authentic empowered self can finally be born. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because he has found the source of power that exists beyond the reach of external validation or rejection, the power of being fully, courageously, authentically himself.